Welcome back to Angular Catch-Up, the podcast where we dive deep into everything happening in Angular world. I'm Jarek.
And I'm Sonu. We're excited to bring you another insightful discussion today.
Today, we are thrilled to have Jessica Janiuk from the Angular team joining us. Jessica, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. And thanks for the probably correct pronunciation that we don't even use in the US. For my last name, it's a Polish last name. So the Americanized version is not as cool.
I haven't known that, but yeah, Polish people definitely don't have like a bigger difficulties with pronunciation. Your last name, it sounds like a more Polish than US.
Oh yeah, it certainly is a Polish last name, but we only found that out fairly recently, so we weren't 100% sure.
Awesome.
All right, let's jump right into it, Jessica. So for our listeners who might be new to the concept, can you explain what hydration is?
Yeah, so and also for those who don't know me, I'm on the Angular team. I've worked on the Angular framework team for about 4 years now. And yeah, hydration. So hydration is when, like, if you go somewhere and you get really hot, you start to sweat, and eventually you stop sweating, and that means you're really dehydrated. So you need to go and get water. And then when you drink that water, that means you're freshly hydrated, which is not the version of hydration you were asking about. So recently in Angular, within the last, I think 3 versions, I think in Angular 16, we added full application hydration, which is something that we did not support before that. Hydration is a concept with server-side rendering where if you server-side render your content, when that content is handed off to the client's browser, that browser doesn't know anything about the application that actually rendered it out yet, because all it sees is a bunch of HTML from a server. So it just renders it out, and then it also is going to be fetching your application JavaScript. So once that JavaScript becomes available, your application bootstraps. And at this point, there needs to be some sort of reconciliation between what is currently in the browser that the browser rendered and what the application knows about. So prior to hydration, the application would say, hey, there's some stuff here. We don't care about that. Destroy it. And then now we have an app. So the app will re-render everything, and then that was it. That is not great for things like SEO. It's not great for your core web vitals because you end up with like some layout shift because there's typically a flicker because the DOM was destroyed and recreated. So not great. The goal of hydration is to completely eliminate that flicker and be able to reuse that DOM that the server generated, and to be able to kind of re-hook in the application to that DOM. In order to do that, you have to know some details about what was rendered, more so than just the DOM is present. So like when Angular actually renders, it is rendering certain data structures underneath the hood. There's like containers and views and control flow and a whole bunch of potential things happening underneath the hood. And in order to reconnect that app through hydration, we need to annotate all of that information about what was present to be able to kind of look it up during the hydration phase and say, oh, hey, this is this. Oh, here's how many nodes are here. Okay, now I know what that is. Great. And that way it's able to like remesh all of the nodes up and say, great, I know it's here now, we can continue forward. That's essentially what hydration is. And there's a similar process that happens within any framework that supports hydration. You have to have some sort of way of reconciling the difference between what's rendered on the server and what the JavaScript expects to be there. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And it actually leads me to our next question. Can you tell us about incremental and partial hydration? How do they differ?
Yeah, that's a complicated question because our industry doesn't really have an agreed upon definition for any of the terms in the hydration world except for hydration. So any prefix you see to that, other than like full application, it varies from framework to framework. So it's tough to come up with a term that's understandable just by looking at it. So the way that we define partial hydration is when you have an application, right now you have to hydrate the whole thing eagerly at once, right? And with partial hydration, the idea is that you don't have to do the whole thing all at once. That's kind of the basic concept. So let's say you have, let's say an e-commerce application. You've got your header, you've got your nav, you've got your footer, you've got some product details inside the main body, and you don't know if anybody's ever going to see that footer. Does it make sense to ship the code for that? And we have one solution for that, which is just using a defer block or like lazy loading that content. But there's a downside to that, and that is if your user does scroll down into that and it hasn't yet fetched, they're going to see a placeholder of some kind, and it's not going to be a 100% wonderful user experience. But it does, account for the majority of people that may not see that content. So I think the idea here behind partial hydration is, what if you could somehow server render that content but not hydrate it yet, like not ship the JavaScript for it and hydrate it at a later time in the case that it's needed to be hydrated. So you can leave sections of your application where we didn't ship JavaScript for it, it's not technically connected to the application yet, but it is known about, and if it's needed, you can then hydrate it later. So essentially, the partial here is that part of your application is not hydrated and part of it is.
So is part defined as part within the same view, or it might be a different route, or both?
Within the same view. So when you're navigating between routes, that's a completely different action. So if you are server-side rendered, you've got your app running and everything is present on the page, and you click on a link there and you navigate to another internal page, that's going to happen via client-side rendering because it's an internal navigation and your app is already present. So that's just a different kind of type of rendering entirely. Disambiguate between server-side rendering and client-side rendering for the purposes of a lot of the recent RFC we put out. We kind of have to talk about the two differences there too. So in this case, we're talking same page, same like your initial load, you've got your content, you're not navigating between pages, but on that page that's rendered, some of it is not hydrated and some of it is. There's also different variants of partial hydration that we have seen out in the wild. So if you're familiar with the Astro framework, Astro does what we would call like islands, where you have a server-side rendered application, but there's bulk of the application is dehydrated, but there's individual sections that are kind of little islands that are running independently of each other. And that we think of it slightly differently because it's like for Astro, it's like little mini applications. And if you've ever looked at how to run it, like you can legitimately have many versions of Vue in little sections or unique separate applications that are in each little island. We've also potentially thought of like islands within your own application that's a little bit more complicated. There's a term called progressive hydration that the React world uses that has to deal with, their version of it is like streaming, and like things are progressively hydrating as the content streams in and becomes available. So it's a slightly different version of a partial hydration. So you can see different variants of this everywhere in the framework space these days.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you for detailed explanation.
Mhm.
So if we understand what hydration is, I have a question. How do we enable it in Angular app? And what steps should we take to get started? And I know it's tough to explain without visuals, but let's at least try to put it into words.
Oh yeah. The great part about hydration in Angular is that if you're using server-side rendering, it is a really straightforward process. All you have to do is provide client hydration and add that to your providers list, and you're done. That's it.
Awesome. It looks a little bit different than the traditional Angular Universal I've been using
Yes.
in the past. So can you explain, what's the differs from what we have right now and traditionally what we've seen in Angular Universal?
You're talking about specifically with like enabling server-side rendering
Yes,
or?
using the server-side rendering and, as far as I remember, it was pretty tough and complex to, use the old school Angular Universal. And it looks like many things have been simplified recently. So
That's
can you
correct.
walk through, those improvements that have been done to improve these DAKes?
You bet. So like we were aware that the universal experience was not the most ideal, the easiest to start working with. For those that are unaware, the history behind the term Angular Universal was is way back to towards the beginning of when Angular came out. We actually weren't focused on server-side rendering at all, and the community actually created this idea of Angular Universal, and it was owned by the community and maintained by the community. But eventually we saw the need for it and decided to kind of adopt it as our official version and bring it into the framework. But we still maintained it as a separate repository for a while. So we had the Angular framework, and then there was at Angular/Universal, and you'd have to bring in code from that extra repo in order to start working with Universal and get server-side rendering working. Now, it was not horrible at that point to get going with Universal. There was like a little schematic you could run. I think the schematic still exists for migrating to it. And you could just run that command and it would inject all of the things needed to start running with Universal. And we were excited about that. I'm not 100% sure when we wrote that and when it got added in, but that was around for a while. But even with all of that, we knew it would be great if we could integrate it more fully. So a couple of versions back, we decided to sunset the Universal brand and just bring everything in. So now server-side rendering is baked into the framework. It is still the same solution that Universal offered, but it is more tightly integrated with the framework itself, to the point where now when you do ng-new to create a new application, it's right there. You can just, it asks you, do you want server-side rendering? And you hit yes, and it's good to go. We've also simplified the file structure for what is needed for like all of the processes. There's one config, and you do still have like your server and client, but you don't have to modify your providers in those individually unless you have something special you're doing. Like we've made the hydration and provide server-side rendering stuff work regardless then whether it shows up in both configs. It knows which environment it's in and pre-shakes appropriately and all that sort of fun stuff. So we've also got hydration enabled by default now too. So when you start using server-side rendering, you don't even have to think about it. It's already there from the get-go. So that's really, I think, simplified the adoption of server-side rendering for greenfield apps. I don't know if our migration enables hydration by default, but I haven't looked at that in a while. So I'd have to read up on what we've done with it. But that's really the crux of the changes. We're continuing to iterate on it too. We recently also adopted Vite as our default server environment. And like we've seen all of the like excitement around the community at large for Vite. So it was kind of a no-brainer to adopt that one. And that's enabled a lot of things for us as well. So it's been really great to see all of the server-side rendering improvements. Like my personal website uses server-side rendering, but don't judge it too harshly because I haven't updated it since like version 6, something like that. And that's mainly because in order to get server-side rendering working back then, you had to do a lot of extra stuff, and it actually broke my ability to do ng update. So in order to really get updated, I'd have to like start a new application and everything. And that's why I haven't done that yet. But, it's never a priority for me. So at some point though, it's going to happen. I'm going to have to bite that bullet, take the task on and actually generate the app anew. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, definitely. So you actually partially answered my next question, but maybe you will supplement that a little bit. So for this with complex legacy apps, or for those who still sticking in the old school way using Angular Universal, is there any guide to help with migrating to the current approach? Besides schematics, is there any tool out there similar, like for instance, ng update you did mention?
I actually don't know if we have anything for migrating legacy apps using server-side rendering over. I think the tooling team might be the best folks to ask. That would be like Alon and Doug. They probably are best suited to answer that question. Alon in particular, he is probably the most knowledgeable about our current infra on like the actual server code itself. So worth asking him.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for these references. We'll probably reach them out. So the next question.
Yeah, so we have talked a bit about hydration, and you also mentioned defer somewhere in that. How does defer differ from hydration?
So great question. Defer blocks or deferrable views, if you want to use the official term for it, even though we all call them defer blocks. Defer blocks are our native primitive for like deferred loading or lazy loading of any sort of dependencies that you want to be able to lazy load. Essentially, if you're unfamiliar with what they are, it's a way where in your actual component template, you can just write add defer, just like you would do with control flow, like at if or whatever. You just write add defer, and then inside that block, you can put anything you want to essentially lazy load until later. And then we have some connected blocks to them, so supplemental blocks like placeholder loading and error, where you can put the templates that will show up before that content's loaded or while it's loading, or if an error occurred while it was being fetched. You can also specify a certain set of triggers. For example, an interaction would be if someone tries to like click on the placeholder content, that's the way that it knows it's time to fetch the block. Or we've got like viewport, hover, timer. There's several of them. You can use them together with other triggers. So if you want like interaction and viewport, you can do that. You can also specify a custom trigger with a when condition, which is an expression-based trigger. So you can, whatever truthy value you want in your component, that will also work. We support prefetching. So this is a way for people to very declaratively decide what they want to lazy load and how they want it to trigger and when that occurs based on user interaction. So it's a separate thing from server-side rendering, but it does become impacted by server-side rendering. So the interaction is that right now with full application hydration, what happens if you have a defer block in like your initial load is it's going to load that placeholder on the server, just like it would on the client. And then that placeholder content is going to be eagerly hydrated with the rest of the application. So if you have like a, whatever it is that you want to be in that placeholder, is like a div that says placeholder, that's what's going to be hydrated. With the incremental hydration RFC, if you read through that, you can see that we're relying on defer for implementation of this incremental hydration. So we felt that defer was a natural boundary for dealing with this kind of partial hydration, incremental hydration approach, because we already know you want to defer load this content. And the difference being, if you are providing a hydrate condition for the defer block, we know you would like to do something different on the server. So the idea here is that if you want to enable partial hydration on a defer block, you provide a hydrate condition, which is a similar trigger to what our defer triggers are. And that tells our server, hey, we actually want you to fetch the dependencies on the server. So let's say you got a carousel and it's on your homepage, right? And that's not something you could normally put behind a defer block because it's going to be front and center for a user, and they're going to see a big image, and you want them to see that big image right away on that initial load. But if you were able to render that through on the server, you could put a defer block on that content, lazy load it, and then it would essentially render through on the server, so they would actually see the content rather than not. But then you wouldn't have the contents fetched until, let's say, someone decides to click on that carousel. So it's a benefit to your initial load. And what ends up happening there is when you render through it, we can leave that content dehydrated until such trigger that you decide. Maybe it's immediate because you want to be able to let someone actually see content scroll, but that still means that it's no longer part of your initial bundle because we're rendering through on the server, but we're not shipping that bundle to the client until you ask for it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, thank you for that detailed explanation. So that leads me also again to my next question. Like, can you share more about how Angular behaves when a user interacts with dehydrated content?
That is a really great question. So we originally considered shipping the dehydrated content with the initial implementation of defer, but one of the reasons we didn't is because of this concern, user interaction. What happens if you've deferred content and it's rendering on the server and there's a button in there and that normally would have code shipped with it and it's not there? So someone's clicking a button and nothing's happening. If they were to click on that, even so, like even if we made it such that they click on that button and then it fetches the defer block, that initial click would be lost, right? So the user would be like, I clicked on this, it did nothing. And then I click on it again, now it works? That's weird. I don't like that. So that was a bad user experience that we didn't want a user to have when we had defer. We didn't want to drop those experiences on the floor. You may have noticed in one of our recent versions, we shipped something called Event Replay. This is an option you can add to provide client hydration that essentially will make sure that during that full application hydration, if there is any interaction before hydration has completed, the event that the user triggered is queued up, and then once hydration finishes, it replays that event. So that essentially catches this case where a user clicks on a button and nothing is happening. Since that hydration is going to be pretty quick, that event would be replayed and the initial click would still take effect. So we don't lose any of that interactivity that a user wanted to happen or expected to happen. So that would mean, like, if someone clicks on a router link, it'll get replayed. If they click on something that will be triggered, it'll get replayed, like a button or something that would, do something in your application. So we're able to use the same functionality with this incremental hydration approach, where if there's dehydrated content inside of your defer block that you've specified you want to leave dehydrated, if someone goes to click on something in there, that is a trigger for us to hydrate. So if someone wants to click on a router link or they want to click on something else, just like I just mentioned, we do the exact same thing. We trigger the hydration, we fetch the dependencies, that click is queued up, and then it gets replayed. So if someone goes to click on like a router link, they still get their same expected behavior. It will navigate to the next page using router link. So we think that's awesome. Like, that was enabled by a library that was originally, it was open sourced, and then we stopped open sourcing it. Now we've re-open sourced it, called JS Action, that was originally developed to support the Wiz team in Google, and Wiz is an internal Google framework. So I know there's been a lot of like curiosity around that framework since we've opened up and been talking about it a bit more. But that library was something that we decided to share the implementation of. So it is now actually shipped with Angular. You can actually go look at the code. It's in the Angular repo. And that enabled this event replay, and it enabled this ability for us to trigger hydration. It's not the only thing that triggers hydration. Like, we've got a couple other things with our triggers that do that too, but that's a key factor. We wanted to make sure those interactions were captured. The difference being, if you're using Hydrate Never, it won't do any of that because you told us you don't want it to hydrate anything underneath it. So we won't be replaying anything or doing anything there. So if you put like a button or a router link or whatever in there, it's going to behave like static content. So that is something that people have been asking for, but I know that there's going to be probably a little confusion around the fact that it's going to behave that way because, well, it's not hydrated. You don't want it. You said you didn't want it hydrated. There's no code behind it. So
yeah. I wonder what the use case for that would be, right?
We've actually seen a lot of requests for it. I know that some people have wanted it for things like ad blocks, where there's other, libraries that are being run on that content. Think of it as like a static content. So if you've got like a blog post or something and there's no need for you to have any sort of interaction in there, you don't have to ship the code for it. So it's a nice way of reducing the shipped JavaScript for things that you would think would be good static content.
Awesome. Thank you, Jessica, for explaining that in detail. I have actually the related question about the event replay. So I was wondering about caching strategies for SSR. So what's the best approach that, how to handle that in Angular SSR to ensure both fast responses and up-to-date content?
That is a great question. And the right person to ask that is, again, Alan. But what I can say is that at the moment right now, like, we know there's a bunch of strategies that are out there that people are interested in using, like ISR, incremental static regeneration, and there's a couple others. I can't think of their acronyms right now. But expect more news from us on all of those things, because we're actively looking into those right now, since we know there's interest in them, and we would like to see them happen too, and have Angular support all of those things. So I know there was also a recent server-side rendering RFC from Alan, I believe, around routes. And I believe that's going to tie into some of the efforts around caching strategies. So all that said, The caching strategy that you do decide to use is really going to depend on an app-by-app basis and what you're trying to do, where you want to optimize the most. So like you're definitely going to want to look into the definitions of what each of those are. Like what is the, do you want to use pre-rendering? Do you want to use content regeneration? What do you want? And what is the best for the content on your site? I think that's the most diplomatic answer I can give you.
Yeah, so I assumed we'll look for the document where these caching strategies, issues, or discussion will be touched in more detailed way. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So what are some common challenges when scaling Angular SSR applications?
That's a really good question. One of the things that we've been looking into lately is the upper bound for like operations per second on the server through SSR. And we know that Angular's server-side rendering doesn't perform super well in that benchmark right now. We're looking at optimizations there. So one challenge might be when you're trying to scale up and you've got a lot of visitors, you may need more servers, and that's going to cost more. So that's something that we're looking at. Another challenge that people face is, well, especially if they're using hydration, dealing with certain kinds of content strategies where you want to like maybe manipulate the DOM. So with hydration, Angular expects that structure to not have changed between the server and the client, but Angular has always been very permissive of what you can do with the DOM when it's rendering. And like the server-side rendered content has, like there aren't any restrictions at the moment of what you can do when. At least there hasn't been. So people sometimes have things that they need to update and they are going in and they're changing the DOM structure. And then when it hits the client, Angular goes, this doesn't look right. I was not expecting this extra div or this extra paragraph tag to be here. So what do we do with that? I guess we'll just error. And there are ways around this problem, but if people are trying to like migrate a legacy application to current version using hydration, they may encounter these problems because they don't realize that they're doing some DOM manipulation in a component, and that is causing problems. So we've tried to make it easier for people to opt components out of that using ngskip hydration. That's not ideal because that essentially means that block is going to get destroyed and recreated. We recommend that people use the after render hooks because that doesn't run on the server and it is the safe way to do DOM manipulation, but people don't know. It's a fairly new API, so it's like people migrating to hydration may not know about it yet. I think that's a big challenge for people who are like trying to move to hydration and scale their usage up with server-side rendering. I think that's the things that the couple of things that stand out to me right now. Maybe you guys have some other thoughts on things that like you've encountered trying to deal with server-side rendering. I'd be curious to hear about those. Always eager to like highlight more so that we know what we can address.
So are you saying that dynamic content is not encouraged with server-side rendering?
Well, it depends on what you mean by dynamic content.
So I shouldn't be able to change anything on the client side and everything should come from the server side? Is that the correct assumption, or is that not correct?
The difference, what we're saying is that you can do dynamic content, just do it in the right place at the right time. You'll want to make sure hydration is finished before you start doing your DOM manipulation. That's really it. Just make sure you're putting it inside an after render block so that it occurs after hydration is completed. We've seen issues where people execute these DOM changes and it causes, they're using things like set timeout or set interval, That also causes stability issues because Angular is constantly getting, like, it's like getting a delayed change detection as it's trying to stabilize. So if you're doing something like that, that's something you'd want to initialize after hydration has completed. I think when it comes to dynamic content, as long as you're using official Angular APIs and not doing like a document query selector, append child, you should be fine because Angular just needs to know about the change that you've made. That's really the issue. If Angular knows about it during the rendering process, it can annotate it properly, and then it can hydrate it properly. So it really just comes down to using right tools to do that kind of dynamic work.
Awesome, thank you. I also wanted to ask about the recent new feature, which is zoneless. So I recently gave a presentation in GDG Warsaw about going zoneless, and someone asked if SSR can work with zoneless app. So I just wanted to check if there's any concerns or if it's totally fine to do so.
Oh, sorry, I zoned out. No, I'm kidding. I got it. So zoneless and SSR. So there's challenges there right now. It's on our roadmap to fix, but at the moment, people have attempted to do zoneless with SSR, but we're still dealing with how to report stability properly in a zoneless world. A lot of the reactivity work we're dealing with signals and whatnot there will essentially fill in that stability gap, knowing when it's safe to actually do all of the hydration work and whatnot. But that's one of the biggest challenges facing SSR with zoneless right now. So we have a few barriers in the way for us to be able to fully say, like, yeah, you can use server-side rendering with zoneless. So not the most ideal answer. I know a lot of people are like, I want to use it. I want to go zoneless, but we're not quite there yet. So, but we are actively working on it. We're working on it pretty much as fast as we can. Zoneless is a big deal. It's a big challenge, and we're almost there. Once we know that zoneless, even in a client-side rendered app, is stable, then I think we can consider, okay, now what do we need to do also to make sure this works with server-side rendering appropriately? Yeah, so it's an ongoing effort. And we just ask for a little bit of patience. We know it's highly desired. We'd love to see it too. So yeah, we're almost there.
Yeah, and looking ahead, what's the future of hydration in Angular? So will SSR be enabled by default, for example, for better performance and accessibility? Or, I don't know, are there any plans, for example, to support full stack AnalogJS development?
So as far as server-side rendering by default, we've talked about it. We would probably do an RFC around that. That's my guess, because it's not that's a big change to expect that be by default. Right now, it does prompt you right away, like, do you want to add server-side rendering? We've considered it, definitely, but really it's going to come down to what the community wants there, because obviously we need buy-in from people. If people want to see that be their default, that would be something we'd want to know. As far as hydration is concerned, we would like to probably get to the point where people don't ever have to think about it. Like, ideally, you don't even have to add code. I mean, we've already got it enabled by default, but we would like it such that, like, maybe eventually you don't even need a provider. It's just expected that it's going to be there. You don't really have to think about opting out of hydration. Like, it's just a thing that exists, and it just works. And yeah, I think that's the ideal future that we see for hydration, and kind of really the server-side rendering experience in general. You really just shouldn't have to worry about it. It shouldn't be a different experience. There are certainly some challenges that we're facing around performance, and I think part of the performance gap is that we are still the only framework that supports DOM emulation on the server. If you're unfamiliar with what that means, is your server doesn't have, a document. We have to create like a lot of the concepts like on the server, so you can interact with those DOM APIs just like you normally would on a client. This was one of the whole concepts around universal as a term, was that you didn't like, it would be Angular would behave the same everywhere. But what we've learned since then is that every other framework out there has moved away from this DOM emulation because of the performance issues that it causes. But that adds some more challenges for us too, because people expect currently to be able to interact with the DOM on the server in all of the lifecycle hooks, and that it's just going to work. So if we remove DOM emulation, we kind of change that behavior, and will break a bunch of people. So we have to figure out a way to elegantly make it optional, because ideally we won't do DOM emulation forever, because it would really be nice to not have to worry about it, not have to deal with that performance overhead. The benefit there is that you get a huge bump in server-side rendering performance, but it might be a little bit less ergonomic to use APIs on the server. So if you want to directly interact with the window, you're not going to be able to do that on a server-side rendered environment. So as we look forward, we're going to have to solve, I don't know, I'd say we're looking forward to solving it, because it is a complicated one. And then I guess on the AnalogJS development thing, we could say that we are supporting AngularJS's development in that, like, go Brandon, do your thing. We're really happy that you're doing it. We love that Brandon and the folks working on Analog are coming up with a lot of innovation. And we think that this is definitely something that we, at least for now, I don't think we have any like plans or effort around like our own meta framework. Like, we're not planning on like writing our own. We have enough probably work on the framework itself that like we've got years of backlog that we definitely want to keep doing to improve the framework. So we're thrilled that like Brandon is doing this work, because it's great to see the desire to have a meta framework around Angular. So like we actually do collaborate. So Brandon will talk to us and ask us questions about like, whether X is available, or if there's something happening around Y that could help them support stuff. So it's certainly a collaborative relationship that we want to make sure that we enable Brandon to keep moving forward with this project. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, awesome. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you would like to share with our listeners?
Anything else that I would like to share with your listeners? Well, we're happy you're here. We are grateful that you like our framework. We're excited to see the enthusiasm around all the things we've been doing lately. And, don't be afraid to reach out and say hello. I think on the Angular side, we have always been the like, you can sit with us kind of mentality on the Angular team. Just remember, we're just people. We just happen to work on a framework that you use. So, we like to think we're very approachable. I don't know. Do I seem scary to both of you?
No, definitely not.
Good. And I totally didn't tell them to say that before we started recording. No. Yeah. So please reach out. We also welcome contributors. So you are more than welcome to come find an issue and put up a pull request. We'd love to see that. So yeah.
From the community, I think we can also say a big thanks for a big contribution. A big thanks, Jessica, for your input in SSR and the optimized image as well. So yeah, I think we are close to wrap up today's episode of Angular Catch-up. Huge thanks to Jessica for sharing such valuable insights with us. And
You're
we
welcome.
hope you enjoyed today's conversation and learned something new.
Yeah, don't forget to subscribe to Angular Catch-up to stay tuned for our upcoming episodes.
Till next time, and happy coding. Bye-bye.